In the last video, we set up this little graphic right here, and that one is representing all the different players in this market. And so to recap, to show us one more time, what we have is a really kind of a regular supply and demand curve. Right? This supply equals the marginal private cost. This demand equals the marginal social benefit. In a market with externalities, these are the two that determine the price for this market and the quantity for this market. But we know since there's a negative externality, there's an extra cost that's imposed upon everybody else. So we call this the marginal social cost. It's the cost imposed upon everybody else. That extra cost is the distance between these two curves. We called that B in our last video. So how do we assess this now? Well, what we see now is that this equilibrium point right here is where we should be at. This price that we'll call SO or socially optimal, and this quantity that is socially optimal. This is where we should be. We want to be. Society wants to be right here. So society wants less of this negative thing. In other words, the market produces too much. Why does it produce too much of a negative thing? Because it doesn't take into account the extra cost imposed upon other people. So we do too much of a bad thing. We buy too many cars. We drive around too much because we don't consider the extra cost imposed upon other people, the third party. So what we are going to see develop in this market is we're going to see develop this area that we call deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is when you have bad exchanges taking place or good exchanges not taking place. So where are those? So I'm going to highlight two lines right here. So the lines that I'm going to highlight are the social cost line and the social benefit line. And remember, we're at this point right here. Right? So if I showed you a graph and showed you this, and I said we're producing that amount, this amount right here, what would you say? You'd say you're producing too many. So if you can for a moment, look at this, again, look at this green line and look at this green line and see why are we producing at QM? Well, because we're not looking at those two normally, we're looking at this one and this one. So when we just look at these two lines, we end up at that point, which is going to be, let's call it this point right here, right? So this is the area, what we call bad exchanges taking place that shouldn't. Bad exchanges taking place that shouldn't be taking place. All right, so where is that on this graphic? Well, we're here. We should be less than that. So it's this triangle right here. So that triangle is what we call dead weight loss. Right? So these are bad exchanges that are taking place that should not be taking place. Dead weight loss. All right. So how do we fix this one? What's one solution to solve a negative externality? Well, the way that we want to think about that is how do you get people to do less of a bad thing, right? So if the problem is too much of a bad thing, how do you get there to be less of that? Well, one simple solution that the government does all the time is they're going to tax a negative externality. So how much do you tax it? Well, the goal, and this is not as simple as it is just in our little model here, the goal is to have people internalize that extra cost. So if the extra cost is, let's just make an estimate, let's say it's a $5 extra cost imposed upon other people, right? Then we want to shift this curve up by the amount of the externality. So we're going to shift this curve up by the amount of the externality. So we tax it by that amount, and that would shift the supply curve up by that amount. So if it were to do that, this curve becomes this curve. So the marginal social cost equals the marginal private cost, and therefore you end up at an equilibrium point where MSC equals MSB. All right, so the spot we're really shooting for, equilibrium, socially optimal equilibrium, is where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, and that's that point right there. So one of the solutions for trying to fix a negative externality is to tax it, to get people to do less and eliminate the bad exchanges that are taking place that should not be taking place.